class in a unique way because what I'm about to share with you, I've got to share with all the other professors who teach this part of the course too, because they haven't taught this part. So that's why I had to set the chairs up there. All right, so today we are going to take a little journey through about 4,000 years of history in about 40 minutes. Okay? So a couple things on the front end. Number one, what I'm about to give you is simplistic. It doesn't do a substantial job of really honing in on some of the historical nuances. I'm trying to give you an overview, but here's the question that I'm trying to ask and answer throughout this lecture, okay? And it is this: how did we get here? How, as Christians, and I'm speaking specifically to those who are of the Christian faith, who are finding themselves, maybe for the first time in several generations, where we're saying, how did we get to this place where we live in this world that is not like the world maybe our grandparents or their parents lived in, where Christianity is not understood in the same way as they understood it. It's not embraced in the same way as maybe my grandparents and great-grandparents would have had it embraced. How did we get to this place where we're living in this pluralistic culture? Like, how did we arrive here? Because I think in order for us to understand what it means for the church to live out faithfully its mission in this pluralistic world that we live in, we've got to understand how we arrived here, right? So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time talking today about how we got to where we are in terms of this unique thing we call pluralism, right? So let me pray before we start. Lord, what a gift today is. Thank you for this great afternoon, this beautiful afternoon. I pray that today we would take a journey that would be meaningful, that for those that call themselves Christians, that they would get a better understanding of maybe what are some opportunities in a moment like we live in today. And for those who aren't, that they would understand how we got to where we are in the West, and what it means to live out a generous life, and understanding how and what the implications are of this unique moment in history in the West really is. So Lord, I pray that you would lead us well in this, teach us, and we're going to trust you in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so let's go all the way back. Let's go several centuries back, okay? Throughout much of pre-modern history, so I want you to think archaic history, right? I want you to think going way back. Throughout most of human history, the assumption has been that the world is enchanted. And I would say in many places still in this world today that aren't westernized, the assumption is that the world is somehow enchanted. And what I mean by that, I don't want you to think in terms of fairy tales. I want you to think about that the assumption was that we are not on this land on our own. There is something more. There is the sense of God or God's deities, supernatural spirits, something transcendent, something beyond us, something that humanity has been created to either be in a relationship with in terms of the Hebrews or to serve in terms of most pagan deities. So the assumption was, the basic assumption of humanity was, we're not alone, it's not just about us, and that there's more to it than what the eye can see. So most early cultures sort of organized around themselves around the assumption that the world is enchanted. And not everyone had the same understanding of what enchantment was. Depending on where you were, the location that you lived in, the culture that you found yourself in, it would have a certain understanding of gods and goddesses, okay? Now, I'm gonna fast forward a whole lot of history, and I want to hone in for a moment on the Israelites. The Israelites found themselves as a community in a unique place where they were consistently surrounded among their neighbors by competing claims about religious faith. So whether it was the God of the Canaanites, or the God of the Amorites, or the Ammonites, or the Jebusites, or the Egyptians, or the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, that Israel was working its identity out as a community of faith amidst all of the other competing claims that was surrounding them. That there were all these other neighbors who also had understandings of how the world came to be, how it got to where we are, and what it means to live as a human on this earth. That was the assumption, that was the belief, okay? When Israel begins its journey with God, and this is something that I think is important for us to understand, the Israelites weren't at first what we would call monotheists, okay? We've got to understand that the journey that they're going to take with God is a journey of growth, right? God reveals God's self to Israel. It says, I am Yahweh, and they're like, okay, but we're not sure what that means. So they are working their faith out in real time. And so we believe that probably early on, the Israelites would have been considered henotheists. Henotheism is the belief that every tribe or region has its own god. And it's like, really, it's a battle of the gods. So depending on which tribal culture is winning at any given time kind of determines how tough your God is or what your God does. So when Yahweh, Israel's God, comes through in Egypt, they go, yes, he's a warrior God. Sweet, that's fantastic, that's awesome. But can he feed us? Like, is he good at that too? And so they get out in the desert, they start to complain, they start to bicker because they knew God could part seas and defeat their enemy in victory. They weren't altogether sure that they had the kind of God that could feed them until he starts raining manna from heaven. All right, awesome. He can feed us, he can get us out of Egypt, he can conquer and be victorious. And yet, some of our neighbors have this God who's really good about making it rain and delivering babies, the God of fertility. And in their mind, they're like, okay, we got Yahweh's good, but these other neighbors, they've got this God who we probably don't want to make mad. So why don't we grease the palm of this God over here, not make him mad, but really just focus in on Yahweh, right? So henotheism is the belief that every tribe, region, culture has its own gods. Now we know what polytheism. Polytheism is the belief in many gods, and that often operates within certain religious constructs. We do believe that probably Israel moves from being what we call henotheists, like my God can beat your God up on the playground kind of thing, to what we would call monolatrists. And monolatrists believe like there's one supreme God and there may be other gods, but they're subservient gods. They're not nearly as bad as the one God. And Israel would have probably moved to a place at some point where they went, Yahweh is king of the hill. There may be some other gods and some other deities out there, but they are nothing like Yahweh. Fast forward, as their history begins to unfold, they begin to realize that it's probably not simply that every other neighbor has its own God and our God wins most of the time, or that our God's king of the hills and there are other gods. They start to realize, no, there is one God. There's one God and one God alone. And anything that lays claim to being a God that's not Yahweh is not a God, it's actually an idol. And that becomes articulated a little further down in the journey of Israel, where they start to have to realize that we've got this other God. Like, we've got the only God, everything else is idols. Now, that doesn't erase the fact that all of their neighbors didn't go, oh, okay, well, thanks for clarifying that with us. We'll just throw all of our gods away. And it doesn't erase the fact that Israel is still at times drawn to the other gods of the other nations. What I'm trying to say here is, Israel works its journey of faith out in the midst of plurality, okay? So the very nature of who Israel is, they existed in real time amongst neighbors who also had claims to religious faith, and so they're existing in plurality. And Israel has been given this unique vocation, and I think this is important for us to understand. Israel's religious faith is a so-that religious faith. You know what I mean by that? It's not that God just does something on Israel's behalf. It's what God does on Israel's behalf so that they can represent amongst all of the other nations that their God truly is Lord. And the problem with idolatry for Israel is not the fact that there's other gods or the belief that there's other gods out there. The problem with idolatry is that Israel had been created, risen up, called out of obscurity, and given this high vocation of representing to the world what it looks like to believe that Yahweh is God alone. So Israel works out its faith in the midst of plurality as a contrast community. As a community that says we don't look like everybody else because our God is the only God and this is how God has called us to live. So early on, Israel's faith is worked out amongst plurality. Now, let's move forward a little bit. Now, into the 1st century BC and then in through the first few centuries AD, there's this ascension of this empire called Rome. And in Rome, so Israel would have been occupied by the Romans. That's where, during the time of Jesus, Jerusalem is occupied by the Romans. All of Israel is occupied by the Romans. The Roman Empire had this unique understanding of the possibilities of pluralism. Okay? So Rome is this big empire that begins to extend its territory. Its military conquests are things of great renown. There's military heroes and powerful forces. They also have the capacity to, at the time, what they would have called modernized communities. They would build roads, aqueducts, and they had incredible capacity to expand and to develop. Now, what Rome understood was that as we expand, we're going to be expanding into territories where everybody's going to have their own gods, right? Now, Rome had its legion of gods, but we also know that we're going to go into communities where they have their own gods. And gods aren't something that people give up easily, right? Because understand that religious faith is something that people hold on to tightly. So Rome kind of took on this posture. It's called Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome takes on this posture that as we move into a territory and we occupy it, those in that territory can be of whatever religious faith they want, whatever religious practice they want, if they first pay allegiance to the cultic religion, which is Caesar is Lord and Rome is the true kingdom. Like the nature of Rome was that it was in of itself almost like a religious worship. And so as long as you pay allegiance, as long as you pay tribute to Rome first, you can really do things the way you want to do things. Now there were certain religious groups that found great freedom in that. Okay, hey, listen, tribute to Rome, Caesar is Lord, no problem, we're going to go about our business. Within the context of Israel itself, they're still trying to work out their claim to faith in this community of faith that they were in the midst of all of these other neighbors and claims. And then now you've got this Roman imperial religion. And Israel has a group of people within them that says, hey, let's just play by the rules, it'll be fine. And then they have people that say, no, we're going to refuse to bow our knees to Rome in any way. In the 1st century AD, there is this emergence of this Jewish sect that had gathered around this person named Jesus from Nazareth. And this Jewish sect begins to move first, pretty much isolated in this area of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. And they started to move through, and there was sort of this movement happening. At first, they didn't even really hit the radar of Rome very much. They're a pretty small group, marginalized group, pretty inconsequential. Until this Jesus dies on the cross and is resurrected, and his followers, or at least the claim is he's resurrected, right? That's how the Romans would have understood, that there's a claim that he's resurrected. Then his followers begin to fan out. And they begin to spread that message. Now here's the unique thing that happens. Here's the challenge for us as we understand the religious faith of the day. Wherever they went, they began to proclaim the message of Jesus, which in Rome would not have been a big deal. Except that they use political language to talk about Jesus. Like when they're talking about this new faith, it's not just some sort of privatized little religious tradition that they can have alongside of this cultic empire. They're using political language. They're saying things like, Kyrios Christos, meaning Christ is Lord. In that time, you didn't say anybody but Caesar was Lord. That was his title. They were saying things like the Basilia of God had come. The kingdom of God was reigning. That's political language. They even said, euangelion. That means what we would say evangelism. It means good news. That was a political word. It was a word used by the emperor to determine the good news of the emperor's reign over the land. So they're using all of this language that was reserved for politics. And now they're saying, no, this is the faith. This is the one true God. And so they begin to draw the ire of the Roman Empire because they refused to give themselves to the cultic traditions of the Roman Empire. The Jews had a little bit of an issue with this because they're like, hey, you're messing things up for us. We live all throughout the Roman Empire. We're able to do our thing and have our rituals, and you show up and they're associating you with us, and you're going to mess everything up for us. The powerful thing about the Christian church in those early years is the same as the powerful thing about Israel in the way in which they related to their neighbors. They were to exist as a countercultural contrast community. That in this world, let me give you an example. In Corinth was like an idol's haven, right? Like you could find any kind of funky religious practice in one city that you would want. You could have to your heart's delight. Like if you wanted to go down whatever path you wanted to go down and call it God, you could probably find it in the city in Corinth. And all of a sudden, Jesus shows up there in terms of his church. And they're existing in this pluralistic community. And they're existing as that community of people, this contrast community. We are going to live as those that represent adequately who God is in this world, and we're going to demonstrate God's faithfulness to you. So they had to hold on to their identity and hold on to the belief in that there's one true God amidst the plurality. And you know what the powerful thing was? The church wasn't threatened by that. The church actually grew exponentially in that time. The church was movemental. When it had to stake its claim, when it had to say, this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is who we understand God to be, and we're giving ourselves to that God, even in the face of threat, persecution, elimination, and marginalization, the church flourished, it grew, it expanded. Because there was something different about them. There was something unique, something that people sought out. So they actually multiplied and expanded and grew exponentially in the midst of the plurality. They didn't have anyone legislating their beliefs, legislating their morality, or protecting and preserving their right to gather on Sunday mornings. In fact, a lot of what they did was in houses and catacombs and hidden places. And I will say this, please understand me, I think Christianity always flourishes when it moves from being cultural to confessional. If it's just cultural and we're Christian because that's who we are, it doesn't flourish. I mean, it has to become confessional, like I am, no matter what anyone around me says. It forces us to own our faith in a very deep and meaningful way. The early church had to do that. For the first 300 years of the church, they had to do that. Okay? So, Israel had its origins in a pluralistic world where there were several neighbors with lots of deities. The early church had its formative years surrounded by neighbors in their communities that had their other gods. Any questions so far? Because we're about to take a turn. Things about to get all wonky on you. Okay? So, I don't want to paint too sweet of a picture of the first 300 years of the church. They grew. It was incredible. It was expansive. They reached the entire Roman Empire. They spread out, and they were dying a lot. And they were being persecuted, and they were being killed, and they were being thrown into gladiatorial rings, and they were being burned, and they were being persecuted wherever they went. So it wasn't an easy way to live, but God was faithful. Well then, right around, 312 AD, an emperor by the name of Constantine. Anybody ever heard of Constantine? Okay. So Constantine is leading his army into battle. And he has one night, they're facing this epic battle they're about to go into, and he has a dream. And in this dream, he sees the cross of the Christians. And so he wakes up and has them plaster that cross on their armor, on their shields. They march off into battle, and they're victorious. And Constantine is now convinced, sort of Christianity. All right? And now Christianity moves from this marginal sect of people spread throughout the empire to now they're moving towards being the state or the empire's endorsed religious faith for the entirety of the empire. They go from catacombs to the center of the community, from backwood places to right into the midst of these basilicas and these they're given prime real estate. Now, if you're the early church, you've got to maybe see this as the blessing of God, right? Like if you are at some point being persecuted, driven out of your communities, people you know have died, and all of a sudden the emperor goes, "You all, I like you all." It's easy to see that as the blessing of God. The challenge is we don't always know what we're giving up when we get something, right? You ever notice that? Something will come our way and we'll go, "That sounds really good." I mean, we do it all the time in the church still today. Like, some politician or somebody will give us something and we'll go, "See, this is God's faith," and we don't realize what we may be giving away in the process. This is what they did in the fourth century. In the midst of the 4th century, there is a movement to bring Christianity into the center of the empire and to say this is the endorsed religion of the empire. So you've got to remember, they existed as a people amongst neighbors who all these neighbors had the plurality of belief, and that was allowed within the Roman Empire, to now they're being thrust into the center of the Roman Empire, and they're being told that this is the religion of the empire. So now that plurality and that multiplicity is being subsumed under the belief that we are the Holy Roman Empire. We are a Christendom empire. And so the assumption is if you belong to the Roman Empire, then you belonged to the Christian people. That was just the assumption. We're talking mass baptisms. At times we're talking forced baptisms. Because the assumption was we work best if we're all of one religious faith. One of the things we have to understand is this religious faith then becomes tied to political aspirations. So it becomes very difficult to separate or divide the faith of the church with the prospects of the empire. Does that make sense? So those two are now bound together. So wherever power and politics pushes you, the church is hot on its heels. In fact, it's often engrafting clergy, like the popes, and at one point there was more than one at a single time, to sanctify political ambition from the empire. But it was all done in the name of God, in the name of Jesus. It leads to conquests and conversions. It means we often used tactics that were inconsistent with Jesus and inconsistent with the Christian faith. It often meant cultural hegemony and colonialism. That is sort of those seem to go hand in hand. And so within this season of, and we want to think from about 300 AD to about 1500 AD, okay, over about a 1200-year process. The imperial pursuits and the church's power were wed together. So wherever they went, whatever conquests, whatever explorations, whatever places that were conquered were done in the name of Jesus. It even led to wars being fought in protection not only of the political lands, but of the claim of Jesus. This is where we get like the Crusades, right? Protection of sacred holy lands, but we also had a very political orientation to it as well. It's interesting during this time that as Christendom has sort of held sway over the West, there is this emergence of this new monotheism. And this new monotheism that starts in about 600 AD. Anybody know what that new monotheism is called? Islam begins to emerge, and it's setting itself up as the competitor, the monotheistic competitor in terms of conquest. Because it also has political aspirations of spreading out throughout the territory. And you remember what we talked about a couple weeks ago, when you put two monotheisms who have political aspirations against one another, things tend to get bloody. And throughout several hundred years, there's a bloodiness that comes with it. violence as a means of preserving imperial interests and the integrity of the religious faith. There is one unique, or maybe a couple, but a very few, but there's some unique moments throughout this history that are sort of outliers where multiple religious faiths live together in harmony. One of those is in a place called Cordoba in Spain, where you had Christians, Muslims, and Jews all living in relative harmony without violence, and actually was a flourishing intellectual center at the time as well. That was happening in Cordoba, Spain. But those are outliers, and those didn't happen very often. The assumption generally was we're best if we're all one religion. This is Western history. We're all one religion faith of Christianity. All right, questions so far? Questions or thoughts so far? Yes, Gabby.
Do you have any book recommendations or articles or videos or anything if we wanted to dive deeper into this?
Yes. I'd have to look up some names.
I'll email you.
Yes, do that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Other questions, thoughts? Need me to explain anything? So let's backtrack real quick. The world was enchanted. Israel took its place amidst neighbors who also believed that they had religious faith. So plurality was the assumption. The Christian faith for the first 300 years operated in much the same way, in the midst of plurality, difference, and they thrived as a countercultural people. Then plurality, difference, is squashed, and one single faith arises. And this becomes the period of time called Christendom, okay? And now we don't value plurality, we value homogeneity, right? That everything is one. We are one Christian faith. So this worked for quite a while, and I say worked politically, fairly corruptive of religion most of the time. Interestingly enough, just this is a side note, you've heard of monastic communities, right? Maybe St. Benedict or St. Ignatius or St. Francis of Assisi, right? Most monastic communities arose during this time as a sort of rejection of some of the corruptions that were happening at this time, okay? So they were ways to say, we're going to preserve the integrity of the Christian faith even as it's becoming politically corruptive, okay? So there were reformations happening within the actual religious faith at the time. All right, so we're about to take another turn. Right around, let's say 15th and 16th century, we come to a period of time where there's this movement called the Renaissance, which is a return back to the classics. It's a study of the ancients. It's a recovery of ancient languages. It's the empowerment of knowledge. And it's spreading throughout the West, okay? And in the midst of this time, there is some breakdowns happening within the empire itself, where there's different princes and sovereign groups that are starting to have problems with each other. I mean, not that they didn't already, but it's becoming very fractured and fragmented. It's hard to hold together all the pieces in one big political means. And it's in the midst of this time that there's this guy named Martin Luther who begins to recognize the abuses that were happening in the Catholic Church. And he wasn't writing from the outside, he was writing from the inside because he was a Catholic monk. Okay? He was an educator, teacher. And so he begins to identify the corruptions that were amid all of what was happening in the Catholic Church. And he writes them down on a piece of paper called anybody know? 95 Theses. And he takes it to a church in Wartburg, Germany, and he nails it on the door. Now, interestingly enough, just say this too, this all happens at the same time that the printing press is invented. So what might have been 200 years, a single piece of paper put on a door and criticizing the church quickly became this mass-produced diatribe against the church. Like, it's the first social media medium, right? This thing is posted and liked and shared a lot, okay? In the midst of this, the Catholic Church doesn't necessarily like to be challenged very much. In fact, they don't appreciate that. So they tell Luther that he has to recant, and Luther refuses to do so. Well, Germany seizes upon this, and they said, Luther, we've got a spot for you. You come hang out with us. We'll protect you. And here's where we see the splintering of an empire and the splintering of the Christian faith. No longer, because of what's going to become called the Reformation, do the Catholics and the Catholics alone, there was the Eastern Orthodox too, but that's kind of this side. But primarily, it was no longer that the Catholics alone had control over the religious faith. Now there were these factions within Christianity. Luther in Germany, Calvin in Switzerland, right? Like you see the emergence of these people who begin to articulate the Christian faith in different ways. Now understand, this is still not pluralism. This is still homogeneity, right? It's diversity within a religious tradition, but it's still very much Christendom. It still operates the assumption that we are best if we're all Christian. They're just fighting for which Christian faith is the best. And when I say fighting, I mean literally. There's going to be a war that breaks out throughout Europe from 610 to 640. It's going to be one of the most bloody that Europe's ever experienced. And it has at its root political factions and religious faith. Anybody know what that war from 1610 to 1640 is? 30 Years' War. That's right. Very good. 30 Years' War erupts. Now, so this is happening. At the same time, there's a scientific revolution that's happening that's calling into question the truth of the Catholic Church's assumption about the universe and how the universe works. So there's all of these things that are calling into question, sowing the seeds for Christendom's demise. All right? Then we move into the period right after the 30 Years' War. And this period is going to be known as the Enlightenment. Anybody heard of the Enlightenment before? Modernity, yes. So the Enlightenment basically serves as a reaction against all that they had just witnessed in the 30 Years' War and in the prior century and a half. Instead of relying upon religion and religious faiths, which, let's face it, they couldn't be trusted with science because they got that wrong. They seem to be pretty apt at killing each other, which is problematic. And they can't seem to necessarily agree on what truth is. There's a group of philosophers at the time that say, you know what, maybe it's possible that we can conceive of what is true and what is real in this world and in this universe outside of religious tradition. So they elevate, instead of faith and religion, they elevate reason. And instead of the community that you're a part of, they elevate the individual. The individual has the capacity within themselves to rationalize and reason towards truth and reality. And we can appropriate that through scientific methodology to prove what we know to be true. So I'm no longer studying the world with the assumption, get this is huge. I don't have to operate under the assumption that the world is inhabited and enchanted any longer. Now, all of them would still believe it is. But they say we can sort of bracket that out. Like, that's not where we're going to focus our attention. We're not going to start under the assumption that we've got to first clear the bar of the doctrinal litmus test before we determine what truth is. We're going to start with the assumption that I think, therefore I am. Right? I can cognitively and rationally come to understand what truth and reality and what holds everything together really is. And so there's some divisions that happen in this. There's the division between the sacred and the secular, between what happens in the private sphere, which is where religion is done, and the public sphere, which is where science, reason, and politics are done. Instead of focusing on the particularity of any religious faith, we're looking at what is universally true for all people at all places at all times, regardless of what religion they believed. And there's this pitting of reason and faith against one another, and there's a focus on the individual versus the community. We want to construct a knowledge of what is truth that is secure, that is rational, that is universal, and that is objective, and that is not tied to any religious faith. Now, here's the deal, and I think this is really important for us. Throughout modernity, the assumption is we're still sort of holding on to Christendom, culturally. Maybe not in the same way that it was in 800 AD. But in 1700s and 1800s, the assumption is Christianity is still the thing for the West. Like, even as we settle into this new land called the United States, it wasn't... I think it's funny because we always talk about how it was settled for religious tolerance. It was settled in part for a religious sect within Christianity to have tolerance for itself, not necessarily for others. The different denominations and the different sects of Christianity didn't always play together nicely even once they got here, right? They were all trying to carve out a space for themselves to exist. But I think it's important for us to understand that still culturally, within this context, the religious faith of Christianity holds great sway. Now, there's an entire philosophical construct over here that is calling into question the claims of Christianity, but Christianity still exercises a lot of influence in everything cultural that's happening in the West. That is ultimately going to start to be disrupted and disturbed through some significant seismic shifts. Towards the end of the 19th century, so I want you to think the late 1800s, there's a number of philosophical movements that question the validity of religious myths at all. Darwin, you all remember Darwin? Starts to call into question the very nature of religion and whether religion is even necessary, because it's possible that there's no real, originator in terms of a God for beings, that evolution is taking place. So it begins to sow the seeds. There's a philosopher by the name of Nietzsche. Anybody ever heard of Nietzsche? There's a philosopher by the name of Nietzsche who says, you know what religion does? It controls morals. And you know what the problem is? It's really only an exercise of power over people to control what they do. And he says, so basically, your religion, your Christian faith, is nothing more than a will to power. You just want to control people in the way that you want them to function. So the criticism is not only scientific, it's philosophical, and now it's a questioning of even how we understand morality. There was in this time a loss of what we call progressive optimism, that during this time that, all of humanity is moving towards this golden age, this believed golden age. Because, you got to understand, we've settled the new land, we've constructed this new culture that we call America. We're seeing the modernization of America. We're building cities. We're seeing advancements and inventions. Things are changing. We fought a war to end slavery. Not to mention all the subsequent betrayals of that very assumptions of slavery. But there was this belief that we were moving towards some sort of golden age. That all comes crashing down at the beginning of the 20th century. Anybody know what might have called into question the assumptions that we're moving towards this golden age? Anybody? What in the beginning of the 20th century might have called into question? The Depression comes after.
Is it like all the immigration that was coming in?
So okay, the immigration is happening. There is sort of an erosion there, but
The Industrial Revolution?
the Industrial Revolution still had with it this idea of optimism. Like, this is a good thing. It's World War I. It's the significant death. Now, listen, if you're moving towards an age of good, like golden age, like as humanity, we're progressing. Some believe that was the blessing of God. Some believe that was the advancement of science. But we're moving towards a golden age. And then all of a sudden you're struck with a world war that calls all of that into question. Okay? But we recover quickly. We say, you know what? This was the last gasp of human evil. We can still, the statement is, this is the war that ends all wars. Like, this will never happen again. Until it happens again, right? And And what happens there is humanity is met with the ravages of evil in a way that are almost incomprehensible. 6 million people killed, right? And it's in this time that all of this philosophy, science, questioning and doubt, private and public, secular and sacred, all of it begins to merge and create this space where it's like, I don't think any religion can have claim over truth anymore. And it's possible that no religious faith is even necessary. This is the idea of the advent of secularism. And if you're going to have religious faith, you need to keep it so far out of the public arena that it doesn't gum and mess things up. Because we're not sure of this God, we're not sure of how things hold together, we're not sure of any of that anymore. And it'll be from like the 50s through your birth that there's an erosion, a complete erosion of what we would have called Christendom in America. Where no longer does America hold sway as the single religious faith of a predominant number of people in the country, at least practically, confessionally. Culturally, there's still places in the country where that's true, but confessionally, it's definitely not true. And we also see, because of immigration, we see because of globalization, we see the embrace of, there's no one universal religion or one big narrative story that can exercise control or power over everyone. It's really just kind of broken up into whatever works for you. And it's the amplification of voices that are different than Christianity. So now Christianity again finds itself in the 20th century and into the 21st century as existing in a marketplace of plurality again. So we started in plurality. Things went to Christendom where it was Christianity alone. Through modernity, kind of broke apart, fell apart, but it was still holding on to this idea of Christianity. By the time we get into the late 20th century, everything's up for grabs, and we're now back in plurality. Does that make sense? You all follow me? How things begin to erode? Now here's the part that a lot of folks who've been a part of the church for the last 40, 50, 60 years, they still hold on to. When the world was still somewhat Christian, when the U.S. was somewhat Christian, when you could trust that they'll legislate your rules and that politicians would still have a Christian faith, and the assumptions were this was a Christian America. I mean, that, for all of the complexities, that's the assumptions that many people make. And there's a lot of complexities. So as things begin to shift, it feels like a threat to the faith. It feels like we're losing ground to a lot of people. And here, for me, is as a missional theologian, I disagree. Here's my belief. In the midst of, we are now living in this pluralistic culture, I believe that we are the closest we have been to the first 3 centuries of the church than we've ever been. I believe we are afforded an opportunity to not coerce or manipulate conversions, not to trust imperial forces to plant our religion in these cultures and contexts, but to again live as a contrast people. To again live as those who bear witness to the kingdom of God in this world filled with plurality. I believe that we are in this epic moment where we are able to see and read the book of Acts in an incredibly different way than maybe has been able to be read throughout much of Christendom. Where we are moving into cultures and contexts where we are not going to be blessed just because we're Christian. In fact, we're often going to be criticized, but it's in there that we get to bear evidence in our life to the fruit of God's Spirit. It's there we get to begin to demonstrate what compassion, what grace, what mercy, what hope, and joy looks like. Where we get to stand for things that are just and right and true and noble in this world. We get to give voice to those who don't have any voice. We get to stand along the margins with those who have been left out for so long. We may not be in the center of power anymore, but it doesn't mean we don't have influence. It doesn't mean we can't leverage the unique roles and spaces and places that we find ourselves. I think we're in a time of profound hope. Not the demise of hope as though the world has fallen apart around us, but as this unique moment where you and I are able to press in as confessional Christians who believe that how I live and where I go and where I work, in the neighborhoods I live in, it matters. That my presence, listen, I'm gonna say this because I have a friend of mine. He moved into a neighborhood. He was the only Christian in that neighborhood. His presence there mattered. It wasn't for him, it wasn't home, and he's an IT guy. He wasn't, oh my goodness, I'm living in this deplorable, depraved state. He's like, no. God put me here. And I can't make any assumption about my neighbor. I have to live faithfully. And he gets to live and bear witness to this goodness, this kingdom of God in the midst of the plurality that surrounds him. And I think we're afforded an opportunity to do the same. So that's a little bit of history on how we got here, okay? And why some of the folks that we love and care about are holding on to the aspirations of a bygone era or a dream for what once was. Now let me say this as we close. On Friday, we're gonna go over 2 articles, just like we did the other day with articles. 2 articles. One by a preacher named John Wesley. It's called The Catholic Spirit, meaning how do we get along with people who disagree with us. And then the second one is by one of our professors. Her name's Dr. Cmin. She wrote an article on how to navigate difference and how to have meaningful conversations about your faith in the midst of pluralism. So both of them are really good articles, and so you'll want to check those out. Read those so that we can discuss them on Friday.
Right.